Welcome everybody, my name is John Wally and I am here doing a series on our web server build based on the recovery that we had to do a couple of days ago. Today we'll be focusing on the Apache build on our Ubuntu server that we started out. So this is episode 2. And I'll kind of walk through this a little bit slower. Some of the feedback I got as I moved really fast through the other one. So we'll slow down a bit. Take our time and we'll describe some of the stuff that we're doing and why we're doing it as we go along. So let's go ahead and jump in. All right, as we switch over to the desktop, what we're going to do is first remember yesterday when we went through, we talked about how to set this up to make sure that we're secure and we can log in remotely. So the big thing that we're going to do on the remote side of things is basically we're going to have a secure shell and we're actually going to log into the interface. So locally, I'm working on a virtual machine locally until we can get to the point where we're on the live server, and then we'll cut over. So I'm going from my MacBook here and I'm actually going to log into our server. So I know that my server login, my IP address is 10.1.0.114. That's an internal address. If you guys are doing that, you can make that address anything you want to. That's just for us testing and deploying this. So I'm going to go into JWally because that's the account we created yesterday, 10.1.0.114. And we'll go ahead and, oops, I saw that immediately. 10.0.114, and we'll log in. So we're logged into our server. Now, the commands that we're going to be doing on here, we're going to need root access for most of the time, and instead of having to go sudo over and over and over until it remembers those credentials, I'm just going to go in, I'm going to say sudo, and I'm going to create a new bash shell with elevated privileges. And it'll ask me for that. Now you'll see I have my hashtag over there showing that I have root access. Now I wouldn't recommend operating in this space all the time, but however, when you got a lot of things that you're going to be doing, that's where I'd start. So the very first thing we're going to do is just make sure our system's up to date. I'm going to do an apt update. And apt stands for aptitude. Is Debian's way or Ubuntu's ways of grabbing updates or installing files. All right, so it looks like our system is up to date. Let's just verify to make sure. It doesn't look like there's any upgrade options, but we'll look. We're good there. So we are all up to date and we're ready to go. So the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to install Apache. And so Apache is included in aptitude for Ubuntu, so we can just say apt. And there used to be apt-get, but now with the apt releases and being up, you really don't have to do that. You're not losing much by just doing the regular apt control instead of apt-get. So we're going to say apt, and we're going to say install, and Apache. Oops, if I can spell it, and hit install. And this will just take a few minutes. We're going to say yes. If you wanted to bypass the yes, you could do a -y when you're telling it to do that. But I always like to double check myself, so we're going to say yes. And this will just take a couple of minutes. Actually, Apache's not that heavy, and we'll get through the install here. All right, we're all good to go. So let's go check our configuration and see where we're at. So it should be up and running. We should have our services running. And then we can go ahead and look at that. So one of the things that are built into Apache is Apache control, and we can do a lot of things like checking our config. So if we go to Apache CTL for Apache control, and we say config test, oops, we can see how we did. Now the first thing that we're going to see is we have an error here. So and this is really an interesting thing, because if we were to go out and open a web browser right now, let me get this so that you guys can see it, and I were to go to 10.1.0.114, which is our machine, you'll see that Apache is up and running. So what is this? Why do we get this error over here? Well, part of what happens is we start exploring it and moving into Apache. This will cause problems as we go down because you don't have a global server name, and that's what it's trying to figure out. So there's ways that we can go about doing that. So if we go into the Apache setup, we go to CD and we go to their etc file in Apache, and you'll see several things if we look in the directory here. One of those being our Apache2 config. I can go in and edit that, and I will set a global name or a server name in my overall Apache config, and that'll help us get rid of this error. And it'll really help later on when we install things like WordPress and stuff like that, where it's looking for that system ID or that system name or server name, and it can't find it. So it can cause errors in the long run. And this should also match kind of what's in our host name. So if we say host name here, we'll see that our host name is JWWeb. We'll see it here, it's JWWeb. So what we want to do is set up the same thing in our server name. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to actually edit, and I'm using Vim. You can use Nano if you want to. I grew up using VI, so I'm a little more comfortable on that, but any text editor will work for this. You just need to make sure that you're editing it with root privileges, and that's one of the reasons we shifted over earlier. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to say Apache2 config. And as we go through here, I'm going to put this, I'm going to get through this kind of header information that we have here and go down to where our global configurations are. So in global configurations, I'm going to go ahead and insert server name. And I'm going to say this is jw-web.johnwally.com. So now we have a server name. I'm just going to quit and save out of this. And we're all set. So I'm going to restart my Apache service, and then we can check it again. So I'm going to say system control, and then we're going to say restart, and we're going to say Apache2. Oops, if I can spell. This talking and typing is the same thing this time is throwing me off. All right. Now we've restarted it. Now we can go back in and say Apache control, and we're going to actually look at see if our service is actually working the right way here. So I'm going to say Apache control, and then we'll hit space and we'll say config test, and we'll see how we did. So now our system is completely okay. So we should be good to go. That's the very first piece. So now we know what our global server name is, it's out there, and that piece of it's fixed. So the next thing we want to do is actually go in and look at what ports are listening, because we want to make sure we're working on the right ports and that they're listening on the system. So I can do that by using a command netstat. And it's easy to remember. I have to use plant. You'll see a lot of different ways, but this is basically breaking down all the filters of what netstat shows you. So if we put this out there, what we'll notice is that we're listening on port 53, we're listening on port 22, which is where SSH into the box, and you'll see an actual live connection for that. And then it says we're listening for Apache on port 80, but if you notice that it's by default, it's listening on IPv6. Now that doesn't mean that we're not also listening out there on our own port. So for instance, if I bring this up again, I say new window and I go to 10.1.0.114, you'll see that Apache is running, but we don't know if that's coming across on which port that's coming across. So if we go back over here and we see that there's a connection there, right? We can actually look. So if you look at this, we're actually getting this connection, believe it or not, on IPv6. We're not getting it on IPv4, which when you're on the web, you want to have it primarily on IPv4, and then you can jump over on IPv6. So while this doesn't cause a problem, you see that the site comes up fine. We do want to make sure that we're listening on the right port. So if we do an ls and we look into, let me clear this out so you can see it. We'll do an ls. You'll see that there's a ports.config. We're going to edit this. And you'll notice that you'll see we're listening on port 40 and we're listening on port 443 if we're using any of the SSL modules. So we'll get into setting up SSL later on Apache. We're not going to do that today. But if we go through and we edit this, we can force this on to IPv4. This becomes a problem sometimes on the listening side, and we can force IPv4 by just putting 4 octets in front of the 80. And that means that it realizes that it's looking at that, instead of looking at the hex, we're actually looking at the IPv4 sections. So let's do this here as well, 0.0.0.0. And we'll do it one more time, 0.0.0.0. All right, let's save our file out and see where we are. So we need to restart our system, our Apache stuff again. So let's go system. Oops, thinking of service instead, so restart. Now let's go back and look at what we're listening on. So that's that. So what you'll see here is if we go back, let's reconnect over here. So we'll refresh this. We'll go back here and we'll refresh this. And now what you're going to see is our connections through Apache are now on port 80, and it's on TCP/IP version 4 instead of TCP/IP version 6. So we've moved over from one to the other and pulled it off of that IPv6 connection. Now this isn't mandatory. You don't have to set it up that way, but for this, sometimes it'll fix some of the problems that you have out there. So we have that solved, and we're listening on IP version 4. So what is the next thing we need to do? Well, let's start looking at a few more of the configurations. We did a test config, but I want to get a full status of what Apache's doing. So remember, we said Apache has its own set of control systems, but we're going to type in here full status. Let's figure out what's going on. And actually, before I do that, let's clear up the screen so we can see it. Well, maybe I can clear up the screen so that we can see it. So I'm going to say Apache control, and we're going to say full status. So if you look, it looks like we have another error in here, and it's looking for this www browser across this local host. We couldn't get it. We couldn't get the status of this because it couldn't get this www browser. Now I can tell you what this is looking for. It says that we can adjust our variables and environmental variables. That's really not the problem. What Apache uses when it's looking for this full status is it wants to use a text browser, and there's not one installed by default. W3M is a text browser that Apache control can use to get that status. So we'll go in and we'll install that. So we can say apt install, and then we'll just say W3M, which is a text-based browser, and we'll do that, and yes, that's okay. All right, we're gonna restart our service. So system control, restart, and Apache2. Now let's see when we say Apache full status. It looks like we're good. So now see how it had to take all this information and give it back to us? This does it through an HTTP connection to give that back so that it can check all of it. So now that we have our text-based browser, it's able to give that to us. So let's scroll up a little bit and see how we're doing here. So this tells us that we're on Ubuntu. We know how long the server's been running. A whole 13 seconds now since our last reboot, and we're kind of looking through, are there any errors? Is everything okay? We have one request. We saw that when we did our netstat, and there's a connection, and was it live? So it looks like we have everything really clean. It's up and running. That's really good. Here's our process ID, and we got our JWED at johnwally.com on port 80. They have a get status there. So it looks like we're really clean on that side now. So that's good to go. So one of the things that I will point out as we go through here, we can say, okay, what are some of the configurations here, right? So let's go to the next step, and we're gonna actually get everything we can on Apache. So instead of doing full status or instead of doing our config, I'm gonna clear our screen up here. And we're just gonna check all of our environmentals to just one final check to make sure that everything's good. So I'm gonna say Apache, control, and then I'm just gonna do a -S. And this is gonna give us all of our local environmentals so that we know that we're listening on port 80. We know this is where our sites are enabled and what config that it's using. And we'll get into this more when we start talking about SSL certificates and that sort of stuff. So we'll have multiple configs that will start showing up here, as well as where our certificates are. This is where you would find that. We know the root of our server now is this. We have our document main, so everything's going to go under var.www.html, and this is important. And then we have a error log here as well. So this is where any errors are going to come up, but it's not just errors. You also see that what we'll see in there is any authorizations that have come to the site as well. We see that the user is www.data, and this is important. And we'll start showing how our document main and how our user are not in alignment. And this can cause problems in the future. So we want to go ahead and fix that. The first thing that I want to do is since we know where our error log is, let's just do quick and make sure that we don't have any major errors in our error log. So I'm just going to say tail, and it's under var log Apache. And then it says that it's under error, right? So we're going to look at that and just make sure that we don't have anything here that's standing out. We have a reboot, a reboot, a reboot. That's good. So we don't have any major errors here. So resuming normal operations, nothing outstanding. So that's perfect. Now, but we do see that we have this HTML as our root directory, and then we have the user that owns it. And that means that user needs to be able to read, write, and execute against files. So let's go over there. Let's change directories over to var/www. And let's look at, clear this up for you again, at the permission. So all I'm doing is a listing, but I'm doing a long listing to show all files. So what you'll see here is actually the owner, and the group here is root. Now that can be a problem because as we start trying to write to it, or as Apache tries to write to it, Apache's user is www.data, but yet the owner of all this file system is root. And a lot of that has to do with installations and how we did that. But we really need to fix that, especially for future use. So we can go in and actually change that up so that we don't get errors in the long run. So let's go ahead and first change the owner. So I'm going to say change owner, and I'm going to do it recursively through all of our HTML documents especially. So I'm going to say change the owner, and then I'm going to say who do I want that owner to be? So I want the owner to be www-data, and I'm going to put a colon here because I also want the group to be www-data. And I've done this recursively, not repulsively, that would be really bad. We're going to be doing this recursively, and that's what the capital R is. And we want to do this for the full HTML directory and everything under it. Now, sometimes you have to play with a couple of files in the www, but you should not have to do that. You should not have any files that the system is writing to in www, only in HTML, so you start there. All right, so if we do an ls and we do a long listing of that, now you will see HTML directory belongs to www.data, and that www.data is the actual owner. But you will still find some problems in this. There's some areas where you want the group to be able to write to something, not just the owner. And what you'll find is When we look at we have read, write, execute for the owner, but we only have read and execute here for the actual group. So one of the things is we're going to change the permissions for the group, and the reason why is I want myself, Jay Wally, as a user to be able to write to these folders as a www group, being part of that group. So what we're going to do here is we'll change the permissions a little bit. We're going to say change mod. So we're going to modify those permissions, and we're going to do this recursively as well. And we're going to say that we want this to be 775 so that we have read, write, execute, execute, and read only. So we're going to do this across all of HTML, the whole directory. And if we do an ls tag LA, you'll see now we have read, write, execute, read, execute. So anybody coming outside of the web, they will only be able to read the file and execute the file. Anybody that's in the www group or the www data user themselves, which is basically Apache, has full rights. So the next thing we need to do is, just so that we can do this and not always have to be root like we are right now, is we're going to add ourselves to a group. So we're going to say user mod, and we're going to say -a for adding to a group. And we want to add group www.data. And who do we want in there? We want ourselves to be in there. So we're going to go ahead and add ourselves to that group. So now what that should do is set us up so that we can make modifications in those files. We have full read-write access, and we don't have to be a root user, so we don't have to switch back and forth. So now that all of that's done, we've moved that over. Let's look and see what you can see out there when we browse to that. Now, we've seen this a couple of times. If we go to 10.10.10.14, let's make sure this is still working, and it looks like it is. But we don't want to give away this information on our site. Remember, this thing is going to be out on the web. We're in the middle of configuring, but the last thing we want is to have this up. It's going to tell them that we're running Apache. It's going to talk about where the location of certain files are. So one of the things that we want to do is remove this so that we're not giving that information away. We don't want that to be completely out there. There's going to be some other hardening things that we do in the future. But for right now, the big piece is we do not want Apache out there saying, hey, this is Apache. So what we'll do on this side is we're going to clean up this page so this isn't what you see. So remember, we said our root directory is an HTML, so we're going to just switch over to HTML here, and we'll do a listing. And so we have an index.html, and that's the page that's picking up. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to move this file. So we'll move this over to index.old. So we'll still have it if we ever need it, but we're going to move that file over. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a file. So we can do that by touching it and then editing it. Why don't we do that? So I can say touch, and I'm going to say index.html. Now, if this is all you wanted to do, this would be fine. We could go in, we could touch that. We'll do an ls tag LA, see what the permissions are, and you'll notice that this belongs to root, so I need to change that. So I want to say change mod, I'm going to change own of index.html. Oops, it'd help if I put the actual owner in there, right? So www data, and then we'll just say that it belongs for index.html. Whoops. There we go. All right, so we created this file, we just touched it, it's completely empty. Let's see what it does. So we go back in here and we refresh. What you'll see is there's a completely blank page, which is fine. If you don't have this file in here, let's real quick rename this. So we're gonna move index.html to index.temp, just so you can see what happens here. And if I bring this file back up and I refresh, you actually can see directory structure, which is a no-no. You don't want that out there. So that's one of the reasons we just did a touch on that file. I'm not going to get into how to create HTML files, but you want a placeholder there that's not giving away information. So we're going to move this back, index.temp to index.html. All right, we go back here and we refresh. We're all set. We know we're getting a page, and if you wanted to test that, we could edit it and put a little bit of text in there, like there's nothing to see here, there are no droids, whatever it is. But you get the idea. So we've moved this over, we have our group permissions, Apache is working well, we've tested everything out. So we are good to go. This is the first step of us installing Apache. So I want to thank you for your time, joining me on this journey, and really moving through each stage of setting up this server. And if you're following along, I hope this thing helps. If you'd like to see anything specific, if I'm moving too fast, too slow, please leave comments below. If you like what I'm saying, please say so. If there's something you don't like, say something as well. That's the only way we all get better. So again, thank you for your time, and we will see you tomorrow.